Welcome everybody. You've come to the right place. It's a CIPS webinar today, Women Leaders in Procurement and Supply. It's a second part of our series and it's difficult conversations. So settle in. We're just going to wait for you all to join us. Make sure you've got your lunch and everything ready to listen to some great conversations with a fantastic panel this morning. And as per usual, I want you to tell us where you're from, where you're calling or looking from today. Make sure that when you tell us on the comment chat bar that you pick up at all attendees and panellists. So do tell us where you're from today and what you're looking forward to for this Women Leaders in Procurement and Supply webinar. Part 2, Difficult Conversations. Welcome everybody. We'll get started for the CIPS webinar, Women Leaders in Procurement and Supply, and it's about difficult conversations today. It's a part 2 of a 4-part series. So please make sure that you're using the chat button and telling us all where you're from and pick up all attendees and panellists because we'd love to know where everybody's from across the region and further afield. Firstly, I'd like to advise you that this webinar is currently being recorded and will be made available to all our attendees next week. I would like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri Woi Wurrung and Bunurong peoples of the Kulin Nation, the traditional custodians on the land on which I present today from lockdown here in Melbourne. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. Tēnā koukou, tēnā koukou, tēnā koukou katoa. Really excited today that we have almost 300 registered attendees and this, as I mentioned before, is the second of a 4-part series. Part 3 and 4 will be delivered later in the year. For those of you who don't know CIPS, the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply, we're your global professional body for procurement and supply professionals, and we really are dedicated to promoting best practice and also continuous improvement in professional standards and raising awareness of the contribution that this profession, procurement and supply management, can make to organisations and in fact the community at large. Today's series, part 2, we're going to tap into the insights and experiences and learnings from female leaders across our region. And we're exploring the theme of difficult conversations with 3 incredible leaders from our profession. But before we get started, let's just have a little bit of a Zoom keeping. To all attendees, you've all been muted during the presentation. However, as I mentioned, I love it when you use the chat box to write any comments and do share with all panellists and all attendees. If you have any specific questions, and we know that people have already submitted some questions that we'll be addressing throughout this panel, but if you have some more questions, please address them directly to the Q&A box and we'll get to them as soon as we can at the end of the presentations. So, how many difficult conversations have you had in the last few days, few weeks, perhaps even hours? They come in all shapes and sizes, whether it's giving critical feedback, asking for more time, for more money, for more resources, or perhaps it's just voicing disagreement or confronting a friend, a partner, or a colleague. It's never easy because we naturally want to get along and be liked. And sometimes these conversations are absolutely necessary to ensure solutions and outcomes that not only meet our business needs, but also represent your own beliefs and values and ultimately see you doing the right thing. A conversation really feels difficult and uncomfortable and challenging because generally that there's a situation where the needs and wants and opinions or perceptions of the involved people are diverse. And many times those feelings and emotions are running strong. So as leaders, we can't shy away from difficult or sensitive topics. And even when it's awkward, perhaps especially when it's awkward. Having difficult conversations may never be easy, but there are ways to make those conversations both productive and effective as possible. So in today's webinar, we are joined by three, I've got to say, phenomenal women leaders from different career journeys who will help us navigate across this theme today. So I will introduce our panellists, but I'll leave the bios for them to take us through themselves when we talk about their journeys. Firstly, I'd like to welcome Llewelyn Fleming, General Manager, Enterprise Services at AGL Energy. Welcome, Llewelyn. I'd also like to welcome Chloe Surridge, General Manager of Supply Chain at Air New Zealand. Welcome, Chloe. And Sarah Collins, FCIPS Chartered Professional and Head of Procurement at the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, ABC. Let's get started. First of all, I'm going to turn it to the three of you to take us on your journey. What inspired you to become a procurement and supply professional? Chloe, we'll start with you.
Tēnā tātou katoa, everybody, and thanks for having me on this panel. Fantastic to be here. So I guess for me, my career journey has been somewhat diverse, and so I began my career on cruise lines out of the States with Carnival Cruise Lines. So you could say that I don't pick my industries particularly well if we think about the state of cruise lines and aviation at the moment. But during that time, I actually did a lot of logistics, but it was a little bit part of the operational world, and it was just really what you did. And I did a lot of, as I was hotel manager in that role, it really encompassed everything from, you know, procurement and supply kind of across the board. And then when I came back to New Zealand, which was 13 years later, I love the ocean. Then I moved into a CEO role with an airport company that was a small organisation and ended up doing pretty much everything when it came to procurement, from setting policy to actually doing it myself. And then also you know, rebuilding the entire airport. So that was one of the things which you know, probably got me most interested in the procurement side, I would say. Then I came to Air New Zealand and ended up, I ran an airport operation for about 18 months, and then I moved into the general manager of procurement role. And I think probably what I liked the most about procurement and indeed supply chain, now I have supply chain, which also encompasses procurement, but also distribution, inventory and planning, transformation, etc. So I guess is the ability to influence across not just your organisation, but across the country and in fact the world. And I think that you can do a lot of, it's not just the interest, it's the ability to do good actually. And that can be in multiple ways, not just through suppliers, but it can be through really growing the education and awareness of small to medium enterprise across New Zealand or other areas, and so I think that ability to connect, to influence, and to really change the way that we look at the supply chain and procurement world, and in fact, what's been super interesting for me over this COVID time is the focus. And I mean, you know, supply chain has never been so much in the news. I mean, it's the perfect opportunity. So, you know, I encourage you all to grab it with both hands if you haven't done so already, because for us in particular, it's really shown the benefit and the value of what procurement brings to the table, and in fact the end-to-end supply chain. So listen, it's always changing, it's always interesting. You can get involved in so many industries, very cross-functional, and yeah, so I think that's probably how I began and how I ended up where I am.
Thank you, Chloe. And Sarah, you know, what inspired you to grab procurement with both hands?
Yes, I studied manufacturing management at university. I was wanting to get into the textile industry. That's what I was majoring in. Unfortunately, whilst I was at uni, is when the textile and footwear industry was all deregulated in Australia, and there were no jobs for us when we graduated. So I stayed in manufacturing, but I was in FMCG working for Unilever. So I started in supply chain, and, you know, age 22, I was doing factory scheduling. So that was quite a baptism by fire, getting yelled at every morning if the production lines had stopped because my products, you know, the raw materials or packaging materials weren't there. But that sort of led me into my role, because I was within supply chain, and I'll argue till I'm blue in the face that procurement is a supply chain function, not a finance function, even though I do currently report into finance. But I moved into a procurement function then, right when it was transforming in Australia from being buying to being the more professional strategic procurement, and working for a global company like Unilever. They'd already done a lot of that over in the UK, and it was starting to be rolled out to other countries like Australia. So I guess it was really exciting to be at the forefront of it really starting to get professionalised. This was back in 2000. And I started doing my first procurement role doing directs. So I was buying packaging materials, I was buying raw materials, and I'm actually really glad that's where I started my procurement career, because I know a lot of people only get the exposure to the indirects, and I think it's good to have a balance of both. That did lead me though to sort of doing more the indirect side of things at Unilever, when they started focusing on that a strategic area they just hadn't looked at before. They never sort of considered that you could do a national deal on electricity, on travel and things like that. And just to test myself and to see whether this procurement thing was something I really enjoyed, I went and worked for an investment bank, as you do. But that was a real challenge to myself, because I wanted to really make sure this was something transferable. It wasn't something that was just unique to working in manufacturing, and it was. I mean, any of you who've done, you know, drastic changes of industries will realise what we do is very transferable. And I must admit, I apologise if there's anyone on the line who works for a bank. I did struggle a little bit working in that environment when it didn't have something tangible and it was about making money. And that then sort of led me to my first sort of semi-public service job, which was I went to the University of Sydney. So, you know, that was that. Starting to really work for an organisation that what they were doing and the outputs, you know, the future leaders of the country, researchers who were, you know, doing groundbreaking research, those sort of things I found really inspiring, that I was helping them with their procurement and how they acquired, you know, spent their funding the right way, but also acquired the right goods and services that could help them with that. So after that, I went into pure public sector, which was New South Wales government. I was the Chief Procurement Officer at Roads and Maritime Services, the roads agency, which is was part of Transport for New South Wales. And that was sort of my first, you know, CPO head of sort of role. And I think that's really at the point that I started cementing in my mind that I was really passionate about the procurement for purpose sort of side of things. I was lucky during that time that CIPS nominated me to be their representative on the Standards Australia Committee for the formation of ISO 2400, Sustainable Procurement. And I think that really, really opened my eyes up to really what we could do. You know, we're advisors to our business. We see so many aspects of it. And then if we have passion for things like the social and sustainable piece, we can really drive that through the organisation. And that probably sums up quite nicely where I am at the moment at the ABC. Because it was a role when it came up, I wasn't looking, and it just aligned so much with my values. You know, the ABC is all about how we support the Australian audience, you know, how we represent who Australia is in our diversity, in our footprint, in how we, you know, we're the emergency broadcaster, you know, we've got the unbiased approach. All of this sort of stuff just aligned itself so well with my passion around the social and sustainable piece. So that's something I'm really focusing on at the moment. You know, how do we align my organisation's values and the procurement side of things and really start making a difference in that space? And I think things like the Modern Slavery Act and, you know, we have an Elevate RAP as well. Things like that are really, really good ways to sort of get your organisation motivated in these spaces and see where we can really make a change and really make a difference for some of our suppliers and the supply chain that rely on that.
Thanks, Sarah. Lou, last but not least, your inspiration for joining the procurement and supply profession.
Sharon, it's really nice to be here sharing the time with everyone today. And I'll say with my career, whilst it wasn't necessarily evident to everyone else at the time, that when a couple of years ago now I decided to shift from a legal role into a procurement role, it was like absolutely the right next natural step for me to take. my career before shifting into this role was a legal role working in the construction industry and then in the energy industry. And I went from being in private practice to in-house. And I actually found it had a huge amount of synergy with procurement, including things like running tenders, managing projects, contracting, being able to influence and negotiate, managing suppliers. So it was a really natural fit for me, in fact. And I'd also worked in my time, particularly at AGL, alongside some really amazing procurement people. So I knew the kind of calibre of the people that I'd be working with. And so for me, the move into procurement and my inspiration to become a procurement professional was that I could see that it would provide me with many, many wonderful opportunities and, a really fulfilling career path, including the ability to lead a large, diverse group. They're very passionate teams and I love being able to develop them, to expand my internal and external stakeholder base, be able to get to know areas of the business that I hadn't been able to be exposed to before. And I really love that you can get involved in initiatives and see them through as opposed to stepping in and giving some advice and stepping back out again. So, for me, 2 years on, the career move was, hands down the best career decision that I've made. I remain really grateful, one, that I was offered the opportunity to step into the role, and two, that I stepped out of my comfort zone and was, brave enough to take it on, as well as drive our company-wide sourcing and strategy. Our procurement team have been able to deliver some really amazing initiatives across the organisation, and I love being able to contribute to that. We've been able to do stuff that you'd normally outsource in-house, and in doing that, we've resulted in significant cost and value outcomes and maintained wonderful relationships, healthy relationships with our stakeholders and our suppliers. And in my role, as well as being responsible for the procurement side of things, I also look after facilities management and security. I've got accounts payable and payroll in my remit, so it's quite a broad remit, and I'm really fortunate that I love what I do.
Terrific, thank you. We've got some great depth of experience in the Zoom room today, so let's get started. And why not tackle the elephant in the room, which is gender pay gap. But for those of you who have seen the CIPS ANZ procurement salary survey for this year, both New Zealand and Australia gender pay gap is still noticeable at every level, despite the huge improvements we've made on last year's results. So in Australia, the gender pay gap is 17% compared to the national gender average of 14%. In New Zealand, the gender pay gap is 22% compared to a national average of 9.3%. And the flow-on effect of this scenario is that there is also a gender gap in retirement savings. So one of the contributing factors is that women earn less than men, and so therefore there's less contributions to retirement savings. So just consider this: currently women in Australia retire with 47% less superannuation than men, despite an average life expectancy that sees women living 5 years longer. So we can't just think about gender pay gap without thinking about superannuation. So we have to take all these into consideration when we think about our future. So let's unpack this gender gap. So my question to the panel is, what are your personal views about the gender pay gap disparity? And in particular, can you share an experience of managing this uncomfortable conversation or discussion around the gender pay gap? Lou, we might start with you.
Thanks. Look, as Sharon's statistics, show, the gender pay gap does exist, and it shouldn't exist. I've got a particular passion about making sure people are compensated fairly and adequately based on experience, performance, the market, the effort they put in. And I guess, from my perspective, I make sure that where I'm responsible, gender is not a differentiating factor in terms of pay, and that I speak up when I see that it is. I do know now, and for the time that I've been a leader, when I look across my team, I take particular pride in making sure I personally, am able to redress that where possible. And fortunately, the company I work for have got a plan in place and a process that aims to assess and redress, gender pay gap when it's identified. But the actual gender pay gap issue that I wanted to speak to you about, that I had to get uncomfortable about personally, and then have a conversation with my leader about, is one that actually I inadvertently created for myself. And, it involved a situation that doesn't necessarily feature in the gender pay gap statistics, but probably features in those superannuation statistics that Sharon was speaking to. And I'm sure some of you will relate to this. I was working part-time 4 days a week after I had my last child, and she's now 3 years old. But I was easily doing way more than a full week's worth of work, like just way more. So I was being paid 4 days, but essentially working a full-time load. And what I did is I just decided, like, to get honest with myself. I decided to speak up about it. And I spoke firstly to our people and culture team and asked them about the possibilities. And then I met with my leader at the time, and I was quite nervous about doing so, actually. I find it interesting that, as professional women, we can negotiate contracts and those kinds of things with reasonable confidence. But when it comes to speaking up about, ourselves, it's much harder. So I did go and speak to my boss, and my proposal was to move to a compressed working week so that I was paid full time, but I was able to still have that day where I could spend with my daughter each week. And surprisingly, my leader was actually really amenable to the change, and we implemented it. But for me, importantly, the lesson was that I needed to ask for what I wanted, and it wouldn't have been suggested to me. I had to speak up and be brave enough to raise it.
Great example. Thanks, Lou. Chloe, do you have any comments on this?
Yeah, it's a real interesting one, isn't it? And I think, when we as you were saying, right, if we think about the gender pay gap and all of the things that contribute to that, and how do we influence that as an organisation, and how do you really measure and review your data constantly to ensure that you're being open about it, number one, and you're looking it in the face and staring it down and doing something about it. And when I think about some of the things, in New Zealand in particular, we have I don't know if you've heard of the Champions of Change, that was started by Global Woman, and that was looking at, I think it was about 38 CEOs and chairs from multiple organisations across New Zealand, and really looking at and signing up to being a champion for change and making sure that we are measuring and looking at data and looking at across when you're measuring, making sure that you're looking top to bottom and across, so you are actually slicing the data in different ways, and most importantly also including, Lou mentioned, retirement, for example, would have an effect, but also bonuses, right, and things like that must be included. Recruitment and promotion practices, how do we do that slightly differently? And looking at your pay equity at the same time as you're looking at your performance reviews. And in New Zealand, so our CEO at the time, Christopher Luxon, signed up to the Champions of Change, and we do measure and monitor this quite a lot. What I would say is, from a personal point of view, probably where not so much a difficult conversation personally. Probably from a personal level, most of my difficult conversations have come through negotiation. We'll get onto that a little bit later. But I think for me, as around my teams and ensuring that, so we have, I make sure that they are interviewing, if it's male, that they have a female, and vice versa, so that you always have that equity when you're interviewing, so you get both sides. But also, as we must have female candidates. We look at our talent pipeline, and actually making sure that our leadership is is represented effectively in women and from the diversity point of view. And I think probably post-COVID, it's been quite interesting actually. So the airline leadership team, which is the top probably 35 management underneath the executive. So we're 50-50 now as a result of, as you know, we've had to let around 4,500 people go from our organisation over the last few months, which is a bit sad. But that has created 50-50 at the top, which is, an outcome. But what we have seen below that is that we don't have that 50-50. In fact, it's got even wider. The gap has got wider rather than shrunken up. And the reason for that is because, you know, as you're looking through people who are new starters in the organisation, maybe female, or else, you know, your talent pipeline potentially just, you know, hasn't been there that has been female. So you're getting a lot of the middle management, or, you know, and it's hard to know without going right through it. And we're just starting to on that journey now to understand. But yeah, it's really important to grow that talent pipeline and make sure that you are looking at diversity through all practices that you have in your organisation, I feel.
Oh, thanks, Chloe. And I'm glad you mentioned champions of change as well, because, you know, the gender pay gap isn't a women's issue, it is everybody's issue. And, you know, I just want to acknowledge that, you know, today on our call, we have 50% in terms of 50-50 female male. So that's great. So this is definitely a conversation for all genders. Sarah, over to you, your response to this question.
Yeah, look, Chloe and Llewelyn have already put some very, very good things on the table. So I'm not going to rehash what they've both said, which you know, fully supportive of. And I guess just giving a couple of examples where I've sort of called this piece out. So one of them is I've recently transformed the procurement team at the ABC, and earlier this year I was out to market with a number of roles at the same time, and slightly overwhelmed with applicants. I think I did a little bit too good a job of promoting it on LinkedIn, note to self. But when people were responding, I had people who their salary expectations were just incredible. And it's just like, did you not look at the organisation you've applied to work for? But it was the men, it wasn't the women. And in some cases, I knew a little bit about the roles they'd come from, etc. And I knew they weren't getting paid anywhere near that. And I know we sort of got to touch on this a little bit as a latter question, but I remember talking to my manager about it and saying, look, we're going to struggle here to get people in some of the salary brackets we're offering. And immediately the discussion went to needing to maybe pay some loadings. And I'm like, no, it's equal pay for equal work. If we're going to do loadings, we're doing loadings across the board. We're not just doing it to a man because he has asked for a higher salary. And that was quite an interesting and quite confronting conversation to sort of be able to sort of say that, you know, I'm not taking it on face value. I want to actually understand what people's capabilities are and pay them for what their capabilities are. Doesn't matter whether they're male or female. And I think that's just an automatic, not automatic, but it's a default position a lot of people take, is that, you know, the men ask for a higher salary and then we give them loadings. In government, I found it was a little bit, because of the transparency of job grades and things like that, it was maybe a little bit harder for that to happen, and there maybe was a little bit more equity in terms of what people were getting paid. But still, a lot of the women would come in on the lower levels of their, you know, the lower step of their job band, whereas a lot of the times the men would come in on the higher ones. So it is definitely something I think we've got to make sure we are doing equal pay for equal work when the jobs are similar from that perspective. And also, I just want to address a question too. Mike Blanchard's asked something about in the Q&A section about the stats and how sometimes the women are in the less senior roles, which skews it. And I just wanted to sort of share a story from when I worked at Transport as well. So we were doing a lot of work around getting social inclusions into the big, large construction tenders. So this was things around creating roles for long-term unemployed, apprentices, Indigenous suppliers. And one of the things was around having targets around women in non-traditional roles. And one of the things that I was actually quite pleased with that I came away from working there was we put a definition into the large tenders that a woman in a non-traditional role does not mean you just go and employ traffic controllers to get your quota up of women in your organisation. It was about they need to be coming in. They need to be coming in specialised roles. They need to be coming in the senior roles, because I think a lot of industries are still skewing the opportunities to men, and the women come in at the more call centre roles, by example, which is what Mike has raised at in his comment. So that was something I was really hoping was going to start being a change through a lot of these big construction projects, that the women are actually being given opportunities in the more senior and more professional roles as well. They're not just a tick box on the quota.
Thanks, Sarah. I want to delve a little bit further into something Llewelyn said a bit earlier, and that is that, you know, we have no problems negotiating the biggest deals, but when it comes to ourselves, you know, that's the difficult point. And studies are actually saying that women negotiating another person's salary far better in terms of than negotiating their own salary. So if we can just dive into that, are women underselling their own capabilities? Are we underselling our own capabilities, and how do we address that? Perhaps you, Chloe.
Yeah, I think I look at this, and I've seen this over and over and over again. And whenever I mentor women or people are going for new jobs, and actually sometimes it's men as well, frankly, but mainly women, is to do the research, you know, and actually reach inside organisations and talk to people and understand what the salary bands are and how the organisation functions. And because so often you see people who come into organisations, or indeed come into interview, and don't have a really good understanding of the workings, the inner workings of the organisation. But that being said, also from that point of view, I think it's quite. If you think about it from a logical point of view, and you say, well, this is, and you're really doing a business case for your worth, then how do you market that? How would you market yourself? So, I mean, as a procurement profession, you know, everybody's great at doing that, right? So if you apply the same lens to yourself, then, you know, you can logically work through exactly, you know, your worth and your ROI effectively, and what you're going to be delivering for the organisation. And I suppose from a personal point of view, I mean, I have spent, I think the longest time I spent negotiating my salary, I spent 3 days negotiating my salary. And that was hours of conversations, because I wasn't going to give it. I knew my worth. I knew what the market was offering. And it's not that I was going to leave the organisation, because you don't, that's not a track that you want to go down. But yet, you know, I knew what my ROI was, and in the end got there. But it's about selling. You know, you are a salesperson, and sell yourself. You are a commodity, and that's the way I would approach it. And I do encourage people also to, you know, I think it's a responsibility from us, as Sarah was saying as well, as, you know, as leaders in the organisation, you have to recognise that that people don't. And particularly women, are not forthcoming. I always say that your first interview into an organisation is the best opportunity for you to be able to negotiate. After that, you know, depending on how that organisation operates, you have less of an opportunity to increase your salary as time goes by. So often, you know, you will not, if you don't negotiate on that first interview into a corporation or an organisation, you're losing out for many years afterwards. So and at the same time, contra to that, it's up to us as leaders to recognise that fact and make sure that we are valuing people at you know, where they should be.
Chloe, just briefly, Stephen Eccleston asked, would it help if salary bands for roles were more transparent, so they were advertised? Do you have any brief comments on that?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? And I mean, I think that there are a lot of people who would like to see more transparency of salary, and a lot of people who don't. I think it's, you know, there's quite a split, and it's quite a divisive topic. And so salary bands, yes, I mean, I think that for leaders in our organisation, I don't think it's, as you're coming into an organisation, I think that it's more a profession and a market value that you have to look at. But I think internally in an organisation, if I think about recent organisations that I've worked for, that is an advantage, because you're quite clear about where you fit on the band, but it only helps you internally, and it also helps leaders be able to understand where their people are and where the rest of the organisation fits. There's probably still it's really a taboo topic, isn't it? You know, I mean, I think that people just don't talk about it, but people, if you ask people, and it's, you know, people will tell you. You know, I have, when I speak to women in particular, and this is why I was saying, go out and talk to people in an organisation. If you have that trust and that confidence, you know, people will give you an indication. It doesn't have to be on the dot, but you'll generally get it.
Thank you. We might move, we're getting lots of great questions, so I'll move through quickly, and if we can just keep our answers fairly brief. Let's turn our thoughts to the expectation of women in the workplace, and in particular when we're thinking about work-life balance. And, you know, we're naturally targeted because the reality is we remain the primary carers of both kids and elderly parents in particular. And, you know, men and women are perceived differently when it comes to, you know, consciously choosing to care for kids or elderly relatives. So if we can just turn our thoughts here. And when I think about, you know, I do think this is changing. I do think in the workplace that, you know, it's not as socially acceptable just to refer to women as caregivers. I do think there are many men that are putting up their hands. And I'm sort of also thinking about the aspect of where as leaders we need to lead by example. So we need to really call it out if we've got to go over and look after, you know, children, or do something that's sort of during work hours. I think there's a real need for it. And this applies to both genders as well. So maybe even more so on males' sides in terms of demonstrating that they have responsibility for caregiving as well. So I think there's important to call it out. But I also think we need to be cognizant of those who have caring responsibilities. And Lou, you mentioned before too about, you know, when you were part-time, you're actually working full-time. So, you know, we've just got to be cognizant that, yeah, you're packing so much more in your time. And I know there's a lot of anxiety about that because, you know, people want you from a full-time perspective. So I think it's also really important to have those conversations with your team. And I know in the past that sometimes in organisations that I've worked for, resentment can actually build when they see people going off and doing things to pick up their kids. So I think it's important to sit down as a team and have those conversations. Okay, you know, Lou's working part-time, you know, how are we going to work in this environment? You know, is it a way that we respond and expect in terms of responses to emails? So I think it's a conversation of the team joined together, especially when it comes to caring responsibilities. So we're going to take another question from that's come in prior to today's panel, and it's from Judy Whitneys, who asks, how do you negotiate future new ways of working? And I think this is a great question, particularly now we're looking at flexible working environments, and I do wonder whether remote working as a result of the pandemic has really shifted people's thoughts on new ways of working. So let's expand this a little bit further. The panel, can you provide us with some examples of your negotiation techniques, and perhaps share with the audiences how you think women can be more effective in negotiations? Sarah, perhaps to you.
Yeah, so you touched on this already with work arrangements shifting, you know, and I guess we still don't really know exactly what that's going to mean. But I think we're in a great time now to be able to do that negotiating, because previously it was just viewed that if women wanted to negotiate flexible work arrangements, it had to be all around the fact that they were looking after children. And, you know, it's a very limited, very narrow view. I mean, I'm very happy if someone wants to negotiate work-life balance with me because they belong to a sporting team and they want to be able to do something that promotes their health and activity, or they want to do some volunteer work. You know, I'm absolutely happy to talk about things like that, because I think that's very important in terms of what they're giving back to society, but also their mental well-being. And I think where we are at the moment with COVID is really with us all working from home. And today is my 6-month anniversary of working from home full-time. I'm sure a lot of you are in similar positions. But I have really made some really interesting observations of my colleagues as I've been in numerous death by Zoom meetings. How many of them now the men are taking on that flexibility. They're like, oh, I've got to drop off at 3 because I'm picking the kids up, or I've got to go and do this because I want to take my son to the park. And I've been really impressed, and I don't know whether it was always there and it just wasn't visible because everybody assumes it's the women who want this, or whether the men are embracing it. But I think this is a really big opportunity to see how the new norm can work to our advantage, but also get into the ear of your male colleagues. Talk to them about, hey, how are you going to sustain this ongoing? Sorry, this happens every meeting. I get cat bombed. Apologise. Down. Anyway, but start having those conversations with your male colleagues. Like, right, what are you going to do ongoing now? How are you going to do this? Are you going to continue picking your kids up? Are you going to keep taking your kids to the park? Get them to start having those conversations, because it will make it easier for the women to also have them. It will become just a normal discussion. Doesn't matter whether you're male or female.
Thanks, Sarah. Lou, do you have any comments on this?
Yeah, I can add a couple of thoughts. I think for me, I do think women can absolutely become more effective negotiators. I think everyone can become a more effective negotiator. And indeed, I think a lot of the negotiation techniques that I use now, I've actually adopted from the last couple of years leading, my procurement team. But my way of negotiating is often very relationship based, or about, built on developing rapport quite quickly, and to, keep the human aspect absolutely in mind. But one thing I did want to touch on that I find very, very effective, and I think I utilised this pre-being, in lockdown, but it's certainly come to the fore in lockdown, is you're kind of negotiating more subtly by acting in the way you want the outcome to be. So for me, I've got 4 kids and a fairly busy family life, and it's important that I try and maintain some semblance of work-life balance. And so what I do is I actually try and demonstrate that a little bit like Sarah was sharing before, by saying, hey, I've got to go off and do something now to do with my family, or, there's been all manner of interruptions, not only cats, but, doorbells ringing, children interrupting, during meetings. And, at the start, it was a bit, you'd apologise and you'd say, oh, oops. But it's something that actually doesn't really rate a mention anymore. So I think we've been able to, subtly shift, the perceptions and what's acceptable, and implement change without having to directly negotiate. It's been a lot more subtle. It's been through action. And I really like that, leading by example as a way of, making change in this area. I think that's a really important thing for us to do.
Terrific.
Yeah, I agree, Lou. And I think just probably the other thing is that, if you're from not a very progressive, you don't even have to be progressive. I don't even think it's progressive. I think it's just the norm. I agree completely. Band together, get a network, look at influencing. How do you influence outside of your circle? How do you get in the ear of those people who need to make that change, and think about it that way. If it's too intimidating to do on your own, there's plenty of people who can help.
Terrific, thanks. If we can just shift our focus as employers and leaders and performance managing people, what are some of your strategies around, perhaps just one bit of constructive feedback on not damaging a relationship when you're doing performance reviews or performance management, on some constructive sort of feedback on how to address those difficult conversations. Maybe just one from each of you, Chloe and Lou.
Yeah, so if you don't have respect for the person, if you don't have Lou was speaking to relationships before, you must have a genuine interest in that person. People are people. Fundamentally, I believe people want to do the right thing. And so, build that relationship, first of all. And I think, I remember listening to a speaker once and it's really just with regards to leadership. And they said, be clear, concise. It was 5 C's: clear, concise, consistent, compelling, and committed. And I think committed is part of that. People will if you show your commitment to that person and the change and what they need to do to change, you will generally get there. But if they feel that you really don't care and you're not that interested, you never will. So it's a lot easier if you have built that relationship.
I think it's also being authentic when you're talking to them. I mean, if you're not someone who goes out there all guns blaring and confronts issues, don't suddenly just bring that up in a performance meeting with somebody. You know, if all year you have tried to, you know, coach them and take them along on the journey, keep doing that during the discussion, even if it is a difficult conversation. And it shouldn't be a difficult conversation if you have had regular check-ins with people and you have been honest with them, because it shouldn't, you know, if you do have to have a difficult conversation, the person should realise that that's coming. You know, if you blindside somebody, I don't think you're a good leader.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think having regular one-on-ones and making constructive feedback, giving and receiving it, in fact, part of that dialogue is really, really important. And for me, that's owning and admitting to my mistakes and taking accountability. And I always remind people not to assume ill intent, that and try and really listen actively when they respond. But for me, whenever I'm having really difficult stuff, discussions, I actually expect and invite a level of uncomfortability. I think if that uncomfortability isn't there for me, then I'm not giving it the gravity and weighing it up in the way it deserves. So I really actually expect it and I own it, and I try and make the decisions, making sure I've taken into account that human aspect, and I ask all my team to do likewise. And so, in those kinds of conversations, my aim is to treat the other person with dignity, no matter what it is I have to deliver. And that absolutely helps me and helps them get through it in the right way, I think.
Thank you. I'm going to take a question that Erin Laffin's popped in the Q&A. There's been talk around gender inequality, the pay gap, tackling this at the recruitment level, etc. But sometimes, or even often, this is being generated by unconscious bias within the culture or leadership of the organisation. How prevalent is unconscious bias in your industry, and how have you tried to tackle this within your organisation? I'll put that out to all of you.
Call out mansplaining. I don't tell them they've mansplained, but I call it out. I'm like, it's. I try and I guess repeat it back, or I don't want to make the other person uncomfortable, but try and sort of explain to them, why did you say that way? I remember last year we had International Women's Day, and none of my team, who I have to say at the time were all male. I didn't have some of the awesome women that I know are on this call at the moment. And I'm busily taking screenshots and putting them on a Teams chat for the rest of my team to see them. So thank you very much for that, Kylie. But I came back from our International Women's Day function. None of my team had come down. And there was probably about a 50-50 gender mix at the actual function. And I said, where were you? Do you know what one of them said? Oh, I didn't want to go and be the only bloke there. And I called it out, and I sort of said, have you put yourself in my shoes? I'm the leader of our team that is all male. This is me in every meeting I go to with you guys, and it's never made any of our meetings any different. So why couldn't have you for 10 minutes come down to this? And by the way, you wouldn't have been outnumbered. There were a lot of men down there. There was a lot of great things. I got to meet Ida Buttrose. You could have come met Ida Buttrose with me. So I guess it's trying to really highlight these things and call it out, because I think they don't realise a lot of the time that in that unconscious bias, it's a blind spot for some people. I do appreciate not all the time. Some people do it deliberately. I do understand that. But I think a lot of time people don't realise it, and they're actually quite mortified when you call it out to them.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think also, so we have done quite a lot on unconscious bias, not just for gender issues, but just generally, and how that is portrayed across a range of issues, and so that's been. I agree with you, Sarah. It's a really great eye opener when people go through that training and they come out the other end and go, oh my goodness, I didn't realize what I didn't realize. And some of these things, and it doesn't. And I guess when I talk about training, we're fortunate to be able to do that. However, there's so much information out there, and so many good tools and techniques that you can start to insert into conversations and things. It's always worth a conversation.
Thank you. A question from Georgie Farmer. Some organisations are implementing stronger diversity and inclusion practices. What challenges are you seeing, and how are you trying to overcome them? Llewelyn, maybe you.
Yeah, The company I work for, AGL, we do have a strong D&I function. It does some really good work. And like a lot of organisations, we started off with gender equality and then the LGBTIQ plus space, and it's now moving into other important Indigenous representation, cultural diversity. One of the sayings I love that we use a lot at work is being able to bring your whole self to work. I love that idea. I think it holds a lot of value. One topic, and it's been mentioned earlier, that always gets a lot of discussion at AGL is around quotas, and we don't have quotas as such, but we definitely have targets for women to fill senior leadership roles and women in the leadership pipeline. And we've got a program, I think we saw it in the comments earlier, where women can step up into a role to get experience at an executive level that they otherwise may not be able to get. Now, I'm really supportive of these types of initiatives, but what I find really interesting is I think the ongoing challenge, particularly as we move into a more cost-constrained environment from an economic perspective, is that trade-off, I think, between running a lean, cost conscious culture, and then making sure you resource those functions properly so they can deliver on their promises. And I think it's really important also to make sure you explain the why in the D&I space, and as it's mentioned earlier as well, like bring everyone along on the journey. It should be everyone's issue, and everyone should be able to work together to achieve better outcomes. And so what excites me in the procurement space though is that we can actually play a different role in the D&I space and in an organisation's social licence through like diversity in supply, through local content, which is we have a big push for that where I work, and through supporting other initiatives, like we've got a RAP as well and those kinds of things. So we actually have a really awesome role to play in that, over and above what the company sort of position might be.
Terrific, thank you. A few more questions focusing back on to salaries. Maria Rodriguez asks, is it okay to negotiate a higher salary in the middle of the COVID situation, even when we know that the company has reduced its profits or is struggling to survive? And I might just dovetail that with Lynn Lee's question around working in a small procurement team. It's hard to find how much you should be paid. And is there a suggestion on where to get that information? Some questions around salary there. Thanks, Sarah.
Can I just talk to that? So I've got a current situation, and sorry, this is a bit of promotion for my own team at the moment. So one of the roles I went out for earlier this year, people just completely misinterpreted the salary, and I couldn't feel it because people didn't understand the pay thing. So I've literally only this week re-advertised it. So if anyone's interested in indirects category manager role. But I had to argue this with our recruitment team. I've published the job band, I've published the salary, and they didn't want me to. I'm like, I don't want 150 people wasting their time again because they don't understand what the pay point is. I want them to, if they apply for my job, I want them to be, to understand what we can pay them and be upfront from the start, and they know where my wiggle room is. Because I think if we set false expectations and we dangle jobs in front of people and then we can't offer them the salaries they're looking for. And I'm not talking about the people who oversell themselves, the people who genuinely should be being paid the highest salaries. I think we need to be a lot more transparent, and a lot of organisations don't want to. And that was a big learning for me. So it's going to be interesting to see how this round 2 of the same recruitment activity pans out now that we've been more transparent.
Great,
and probably just to follow on from that with regards to negotiating in a COVID world. Speaking from experience. So I would say you need to be cognizant of where the organisation is at, but at the same time I concur with Sarah's point, is that the organisation also needs to be transparent with you, but you need to be able to say that you will, that don't go through the interview process if you are kind of clear on what their salary expectations are, and that they're a struggling organisation, and then get to the end of that, it's just a waste of everybody's time. But from, absolutely, you should be clear up front, as long as both parties are relatively clear on what their expectations are. But I could say that, there will be hard lines in the sand at this point in time as to, what the probably more than ever, I would say, around, you know, where the top kind of level is for a job, you know, and what that salary expectation is. So, you know, it swings and roundabouts, and it just depends on what else is in the package, I guess, as well, and a whole bunch of things that apply to people or not. But yeah, it's going to be a lot tougher for sure to, you know, to get above that really kind of line in the sand, I think.
So many great questions coming in. We're going to go a little past the hour, so if people can stick around, that'd be great, because I want to get through these questions. The next question comes from Samantha Kingston. Were any of you apprehensive to take on your first leadership role, and did you ever doubt yourself, and do you think this impacts women disproportionately? Great question.
I'm happy to start with this one if you would like. And the answer is I've been apprehensive on every role that I've had to take on. You know, I've always had to tackle that inner voice of you know, doubt. It's got less loud as I think, you know, I've progressed in my career, but it's absolutely been there, and it's been something I've had to, you know, to absolutely deal with. And I think it's helped me. What has helped me through it is having a good network of other women and some men as well who I've been able to you know, check in with about my thinking, and who've been able to be very supportive of me, and who've you know, made sure that I knew I could back myself. And I do think it does disproportionately, not exclusively, but disproportionately impact women when they approach, when they think about taking on new roles, when they go to apply for roles, all those kinds of things. I think absolutely it does. A little bit of apprehension, I think, is quite natural. If you didn't have that apprehension, potentially not taking it seriously enough, but it needs to be proportional, I think.
Yeah, for myself, my first management role, I was sort of told, oh, we're not too sure about you. Do you have leadership potential? We're going to give you this role. It doesn't have any direct reports, so we'll bit of a trial to see whether you do this. And by the way, we think you should model yourself on blah. And almost fell off my chair because I thought blah was the biggest fool I'd ever worked with. And that really sort of shattered my confidence, because I'm thinking, that's not me. I can understand if maybe they didn't know whether I had leadership qualities, but to think that this individual was what I had to become. And I very quickly realised, no, I'm not going to, yes, there are certain elements of my personality I appreciate I might need to tone down or tone up, but I'm not going to be someone who's not myself, just to try and get ahead career-wise. And I think that's something I always try and talk to people about as well, because don't just take unsolicited feedback. Take feedback from a career perspective from people you actually trust, because those unsolicited ones are often people that are the role models you don't want to be. And actually the person who said that to me is probably, every time I think of myself as a manager, is that who I put up in my mind to say, that's what I don't want to be like. I never want to be perceived as a manager like that person was to me. So I think, you know, really make sure that you don't feel you're underselling who your genuine self is. We do have blind spots, I appreciate that, but get trusted people to help call out those blind spots, not people who God knows what their agenda is.
Segue to Nancy Lee's question in terms of agenda. What advice do the panel give for giving feedback or managing up with giving feedback to your manager who puts themselves first and is more of a taker than a giver? Just one of you want to tackle this one?
We're all silent. Yeah, it's a hard one, isn't it?
It really speaks to managing up, if you've got any advice around managing up.
Yeah, so I think I always say to people, put yourself in their shoes, as much as that may pain you to do so by the sound of it, but try and put yourself in their shoes and what they've got to deliver, or what the expectation is on that person, and how they are, you know, how are they perceived as performing in the organisation, or in the political environment. You know, some organisations can get quite political, right? And kind of what are their aspirations. Then once you've kind of done that, you can start to see where they might be coming from, and and almost make suggestions that, so you can put, you know, a typical one that I see where people get very angry about, and rightly so, is work being passed off as their own or things like that. And so if you can navigate the political world of the organisation, you know, if you can put yourself in that person's shoes, you can almost, I mean, I have done it once or twice as well, where you know, I've addressed it with that person, like I have, not directly, but in a way that makes them look good, but at the same time makes me look good. So it's a win-win type of situation. So again, it's all about a bit of a negotiation and how best to make your area look good. But at the same time, what you can do is then that way, when you've kind of agreed on what is going to be success, what does success look like, then almost it gives you a little bit of freedom to be able to then copy someone else from another department, for example, or another manager or whatever, so that you can start to spread your network a little bit more, so that you just don't have this linear approach, that you actually have a few more tentacles out in the organisation. Yeah, it has to be a win-win though. And then worst case scenario, you know, you've just got to call it.
Yeah. Thank you. Look, we're getting close to close, so I'm just going to want to get sort of a final comment from each of our panellists. I'm interested to know, now that you've travelled the journey so far, I know there's more to come, but what advice would you be giving to your younger self? Let's start with you, Lou.
Yeah, okay. Well, similar to what I just shared with the answer to the question before, I definitely, I think, tell my younger self to pay no heed to that inner voice of self-doubt that popped up from time to time. I would say definitely speak up when witnessing inequality or injustice, and most importantly is not to worry so much, because, you know, everything is actually going to turn out just fine.
Thank you. Chloe.
So I was, I think I was always the strong person when I was younger and probably a bit more bolshy. And I think that the advice I would give to my younger self is that you don't have to be aggressive in order to be heard. And I think that there are ways and techniques of, I've always worked in very male orientated industries, and sometimes there, you know, you start to behave like that in order to be heard and have your voice out there. So yeah, just relax. That's kind of what I would say.
Sarah?
I agree with both of those awesome answers. As someone who was a bossy child and got told not to be bossy, be bossy. Make a good leader. As long as you're genuine and nice about it. I guess the advice to my younger self is don't, you know, when you're finishing school or finishing university or whatever it is you choose to do, don't be hung up on the fact you need to know what you want to be at that age. And your career will find you. And Sharon knows where this one's going. You know, procurement found me, and I didn't know what it was, but, you know, circumstances led me into this awesome career. And I put a challenge out. This is my last word, and I'm glad you left me till last, Sharon. Never say you fell into procurement. Procurement is an awesome career. You are devaluing it if you say things like, I fell into it. Say procurement found you. You know, talk people through your journey of how you got there, but please don't go around saying you fell into procurement. It's something that every webinar I go on to, somebody says it, and I always pull them up on it. And if you who know me know I do that, because it's an awesome career and it's got so much we can offer back to our organisations and our supply chains. And please don't go in and devalue it by saying something like that. You would never say I fell into being a lawyer, I fell into being an accountant. So please don't say it about procurement.
Thank you, Sarah. Good way to finish. Thank you to our panellists. Fantastic discussion today. You know, I agree, we need to throw aside expectations, and, you know, the expectations that everyone else has on us, that how we should behave as a leader, a manager, a woman, but we've got to be authentic to ourselves and follow our own purpose. And also we need to follow the purpose of our organisations. And if we can't follow that purpose, we need to think about what we're doing. I really think we also have to, you know, drill down on what holds us back from having difficult and confronting and those awkward conversations conversations, and it probably usually comes from fear. So if you lead with genuine humility, your true intent and understanding, and you will get to the right outcome and you'll have the right conversation despite how difficult it is. Thank you, Chloe. Thank you, Lou. Thank you, Sarah. Fantastic discussion today. Wish we could keep going, but we better close. So in closing, I'm going to say there is a great webinar tomorrow, the 24th of September. It's one with a difference. It's actually a trivia networking function. You know, we've all had these content driven webinars, but the CIPS Victorian Committee are putting together a trivia. So it'll be at 4:30 Australian Eastern Standard Time, and so make sure you check our website for that. On the 25th of September, the Unchain Modern Slavery, sponsored by Informed 365, so check that one out. And lastly, on the 29th of September, the CIPS SA branch are going to be doing a webinar on the disruption in supply chain SA defence industry, a case study. So check all of that out on our LinkedIn page or on our website. To all our attendees, I'm thinking, judging from the comments, that you found it hugely insightful, thanks to our panellists. But please, before you leave today, we need you to address the post-webinar survey. That way, the next one can be even better. We will get to any unanswered questions over the next week and send them out. Until then, keep safe, and we'll see you at the next one. Bye.